Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Tonight I am joined again by Keith Preston, and we're going to discuss Marxism. Now, Keith, a couple of days ago on Facebook, you had messaged me and said that, what is Marxism? You said that people today on the right and the left both call various aspects of contemporary society Marxist when they bear no resemblance at all to the actual original theories of Marx. And it seems like what you're asking is Marxism something unique to a time and place in history that is an artifact of the past, or is Marxism something alive today that's adapting and changing? Is that fair?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think to answer that, really, it's going to depend on who you're asking. There are Marxists who conceive of Marxism as a living theory that can essentially evolve over time and change and adapt to new conditions. And then there are others who say that Marxism is a system of thought that was particular to the 19th century and economic and political conditions as they were in the 19th century. Now, what I would say is that Marxism is basically a theoretical system before it's any kind of prescriptive political program or something like that. Marxism is a way of understanding history. Marx believed that he had this theory of historical materialism, and he believed that economic forces or material forces are what shape the evolution of societies over time. He thought that everything else is an outgrowth of what he called the materialist base of a particular society. For example, the way that people make their living in any particular society is going to reflect what kind of philosophical beliefs they have, what kind of political institutions they have, what kind of laws they have, what kind of moral values they have, what kind of religious beliefs they have, this whole wide spectrum of the human experience, what kind of art and literature they're going to produce. Marx believed that all of that is an outgrowth of the particular material conditions. For example, he argued that in primitive societies and hunter-gatherer societies, cave paintings reflect the ways in which people made their living, in the sense of they made their living by going out and hunting buffalo or whatever they were hunting. So you see these cave paintings of animals with horns and things like that, or in early agricultural societies where they were very dependent on the seasonal cycle and things like that, the philosophical and religious beliefs they have are in some way congruous with the particular seasonal cycles and the star patterns and the sun and the moon and all of these kinds of things. That's more or less how Marx believed civilization developed and evolved over time. And for Marx, the important thing is what kind of material conditions you have in a society and what kind of economic system you had. He called it a mode of production, but a mode of production is just a fancy way of describing an economic system. And he thought that economic systems rise and fall over time, that you have one dominant economic system, and then that changes for whatever reason, just changing conditions, material conditions, or technological development or something like that. And then a new economic system comes along, and then that expires its historical utility, and then a new economic system comes along. And then with each economic system, there's a change in the power relations in the society, that the ruling class of the older economic system will fade away or be overthrown or tossed out or something like that. And a new economic system will come along and take its place, or a new ruling class that controls that economic system will take the place of the old ruling class. And for Marx, the ruling class are those who control the means of production in society. The term ruling class is used in a lot of different contexts by adherents of different types of political philosophies. But in Marxist theory, the ruling class is those who control what he called the means of production, and that's the way that people make their living. So in an agricultural society, it's people who control the land. It would have been the landholders in the feudal agrarian agricultural model of economic society. In an early industrial society of the kind that he lived in, it's the people who control the factories and the workshops and the mills and the banks and that kind of thing. I suppose in a society like ours, our postmodern cyber revolution technological societies, it would be those who control the technology. Bill Gates and the Madison Avenue and Hollywood and Silicon Valley and all of that kind of stuff. So that's really the core aspect of Marxism, this concept of historical materialism and the idea that everything else in society is shaped by the economic system that you have, including power relations, including economic systems and political systems, as well as culture and philosophy and religion, all these other things. That's the essence of Marxism. And I think once you drop that idea, once you drop the idea of historical materialism, you don't really have Marxism anymore. For instance, nowadays it's fashionable for a lot of people on the far right to refer to the cultural left as a form of cultural Marxism. The feminist, gay liberation, anti-racist, ecological, so anti-ageist, whatever left. A lot of critics of the left will refer to that as cultural Marxism. But I think that to have cultural Marxism, you really have to set Marxism on its head, because according to Marxism, culture is a product of an economic system. And Marx would have laughed at the idea that a culture is the foundation of a society and that the economic system is an outgrowth of that. Now, I actually would tend to agree more with the idea that before you really get an economic system, you have to have all kinds of other preconditions. I think that economic systems and social systems are a convergence of everything from geographical and ecological and topographical conditions to just historical conditions and military and political and genetics and human psychology and anthropology and all sorts of other things. I don't really adhere to deterministic theories or reductionist theories about how one determining factor shapes a whole civilization or a whole society. I tend to think that that's a real problem with Marxism, and it's also a problem with other theories that hold to a similar kind of singular determinism. For example, a lot of libertarians have a similar kind of economic determinism, and a lot of racialist types have a type of racial determinism that they believe in. And I think all of that is kind of a very narrowly focused way to look at it. But it's problematic to say that modern cultural leftism is just a variant of Marxism. At the very minimum, you'd have to say it stands Marxism on its head, in which case it's not really Marxism anymore, it's something else. Marxism is, I think, an interesting set of ideas in the sense that it's interesting to look and see what Marx actually got right. I think Marx got certain things right. His understanding of how economic systems developed over time is interesting, and I think has a lot of truth to it. The idea that in different epochs in history, you have a different mode of production that's dominant, whether it's hunter-gatherer society, whether it's the pastoral horticultural society, whether it's the agricultural revolution, whether it's the latter industrial revolution, or whether it's the cyber revolution or post-industrial societies we have today. You do see that changing over time, and you do see over time these modes of production or economic systems becoming dominant, and they do so in a way that cuts across standard political and ideological values of other kinds. For example, in the agricultural realm, during the time of the agricultural revolution and the subsequent agricultural societies that existed for thousands of years, you had a relatively similar system in most places, even though the culture and religion and specific social institutions and family relations and all kinds of things might have been different. So I think Marxism has some truth to it in that sense about the evolution of economic history. Marx also was pretty good at identifying class relationships as they were during his time. He talked about how you had the growth of this massive industrial working class that was historically unprecedented, the proletariat, as he called it. The way that he described how what he called the bourgeoisie, or the capitalist class, the financial class, how that had become the dominant class in society, whereas in traditional agricultural societies, the merchant class, the financial class, is really sort of a middle class. And also his ideas on statecraft are interesting in the sense that he was one of the early political theorists who argued that you can't really separate economic power from political power. I think that's another one of his core insights that's really important, and it's something that a lot of people miss. For example, I've actually had libertarians tell me that there's no such thing as economic power. Well, that's nonsense. I mean, tell Donald Trump there's no such thing as economic power. Tell Bill Gates there's no such thing as economic power. Of course, there's economic power. So I think Marx, in that regard, had a lot of insights into the nature of political economy. Now, I'm not really interested in all of the the technical aspects of Marxism in terms of microeconomics. Like, I'm not interested in defending the labor theory of value or the theory of surplus value and all of that. That aspect of his thinking I don't find very interesting. I mean, regardless of what the truth of it is or whatever. I do think that a major flaw in Marx's theory is, aside from some of the things I've already mentioned, is the fact that he never really subjected politics itself to much of a critique, other than to regard the state as a kind of outgrowth of economic power and class power. For example, in Marx's writings, he never talks much about what his ideal state would look like. He never talks much about what kind of institutional structures, laws, all of that kind of stuff he would have preferred. And there's almost nothing like that in any of his writings. As prolific and voluminous as his writings are, there's almost no reference to those kinds of questions. And I think the reason for that is he just didn't think it was that important. He simply saw the state as an instrument of class power. And he thought that, well, what matters is the dominant mode of production and the dominant economic class, and whatever kind of state or governmental system or political system you have is simply a reflection of the class interests of the dominant class. And now I suspect that he probably would have granted for a lot of particularity when it comes to different types of political systems. For instance, I know you had Eugene Montalvant on the program once, and he was talking about how in his version of socialism, he's a nationalist, anti-capitalist. He's not a Marxist, but he was saying how in his version of socialism, you can have all kinds of things that are considered socialism. It could be Kim Il-sungism, or the North Korean idea of the Juche idea, or it could be German National Socialism, or it could be American-style individualist anarchism like Benjamin Tucker. I suspect if you had have asked him, Marx probably would have had a similar view, in that he might have conceded that different types of cultures and societies might have had different types of socialism or communism. For instance, Marx and Engels were famous for advocating violent revolution, and they had a very Jacobin model, French Revolution idea of what revolution was. But Marx also gave a speech in Holland once where he argued that it would be possible perhaps to achieve socialism by democratic means in Holland, because it was a democratic country. And he also mentioned England and America, which at the time were one of the few countries where the democratic government was well established. So I think that given that, he probably believed that the kind of forms socialism would take would vary a lot in terms of culture and nationality and specific conditions and things of that nature. Another problem with Marx's theory of socialism is that he never really described what socialism would actually look like in practice, other than simply being class ruled by the proletariat. And I think that has certainly been a source of a lot of confusion among Marxists since then, because there's all kinds of ideas that have been labeled Marxist and socialist and so forth. His view was that it would evolve on its own. It would just kind of naturally happen. So you couldn't really predict it in advance. That, I think, is a major weakness in Marxist theory. I mean, if you're advocating for an entirely different society and an entirely different civilization in many ways, then you need to at least be able to explain what it's going to look like on some basic level. Since then, of course, there have been all sorts of people that have tried to apply Marxist theory in all kinds of ways. What Americans typically think of as Marxism-Leninism, which is the Soviet model of socialism. The idea that you have what they call a vanguard party, that is a revolutionary party that ostensibly acts in the name of the working class and then seizes control of the state and sets up what they call the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is really just a military dictatorship, ostensibly in the name of class rule. That's Leninism, and that's the model of Marxism that certainly became dominant throughout the 20th century when Marxist thinking was at its peak of influence. And then there's Stalinism, which is an even more extreme point of view, which is sort of a Marxism-Leninism fused with Russian nationalism. And then there's Maoism, which is argues that the basis of the revolution is the peasant class. And then there's Trotskyism, which advocates a worldwide revolution against capitalism, versus the Stalinist idea of building socialism in one country. And along the way, throughout the unfolding of Marxist movements in the 20th century, you see different currents that kept on adding different new ideas to Marxism. You had some that went in the other direction. You had some that became more moderate and reformist in nature and accepted democratic government or social change through peaceful means and things like that. For example, in Western Europe, you had in the Cold War period, you had what was called Euro-communism, which is the idea of achieving communism as part of a normal Western-style democratic parliamentary process. You had the communist parties in Italy and Spain and some other places like that that developed that kind of outlook. In other words, they basically became social democrats. They really weren't communists anymore. And then you have so you had some Marxists that went in that direction, and then you had others that became almost like anarchists. They were interested in workers' councils and militant labor unions and things like that. And then you had other Marxist-Leninists that became even more extreme. You had groups like the Shining Path in Peru, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia that took what they call Marxism in all kinds of wild and crazy directions. In Peru, for example, the Shining Path tried to claim that they were the rightful heirs of the traditional Inca civilization. They even called their philosophy Inca Maoism at one particular point. And then the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, they believed themselves to be descendants of the Angkor civilization, the ancient Cambodian civilization. So one thing about Marxist movements in the 20th century is that they tended to improvise quite a bit based on their own circumstances. I don't know that Marx himself would have ever endorsed any of that. I think he might have allowed for a plurality of different ideas, on a cultural basis in terms of what socialism might be. But the idea of mixing Marxist theory with some of these other ideas, I think he probably would have balked at. In fact, Marx himself did not believe that socialism was even possible in societies that had not yet achieved a certain level of capitalist development. He believed that capitalism had to first be introduced in a society. It had to develop to a certain point where you had a large proletarian class that had become immiserated due to class polarization and economic conditions. And then that creates a revolutionary crisis where you ostensibly are going to have a workers' revolution and create a new social system. But he believed that could only happen in advanced capitalist countries. He thought that the first socialist countries would be England and America, because those are the ones where capitalism was actually the most advanced during his own time. And he thought that it would happen, that the socialist revolution would happen in Europe, which was the only part of the world at the time which was industrialized. He thought that Russia, for example, it's ironic that Russia was the first country that actually experienced a Marxist revolution, because he thought Russia was not an appropriate place for a socialist revolution, because it essentially was not a capitalist country. It was really more of a feudal country. And ironically, there never really was a Marxist revolution in an actual advanced industrial society. That virtually all Marxist revolutions have happened in what were largely pre-modern or pre-industrial or very early industrial societies. Marxist revolutions of the 20th century all happened in what were essentially third world countries. So it's interesting to see how some of that actually panned out in reality.
Yeah, you covered a lot there in Marxism. The question is, how much can you change the theory before it's no longer Marxism? Because initially, Marx believed that, again, it would be an advanced capitalist society where the workers would come together and overthrow the bourgeoisie. As you pointed out, what actually happened was it occurred in primitive countries like Russia and China. And then, of course, he also didn't really have a fully fleshed out notion of the vanguard, which was basically, after Marx, you had a big debate between Bernstein and Lenin. Bernstein was the reformist who wanted to go down, essentially social democracy, and Lenin wanted to go down the route of immediate revolution via the vanguard. And then the next major step was, I actually think it was someone from Armenia or the Caucasus who interpreted Marx in terms of racial groups. So racial groups were the oppressed proletariat. And that, of course, eventually led to fascism, because Mussolini came up with the idea of the proletariat nation. He viewed Italy as a proletariat nation oppressed by the capitalist countries of England and the United States and France. And then, of course, China under Mao further deviated from Marx by arguing that it was the peasants, because China, of course, had a very small industry with very few workers that could be mobilized. And in fact, even Lenin tacitly admitted the anarchists were right in the revolution by appropriating their pro-peasant propaganda, even though he didn't necessarily believe it himself, as the land confiscation that was pursued by him and abandoned and then later finished by Stalin was demonstrated there. It is interesting that during the Civil War, Lenin actually used poison gas against the peasant uprisings against the grain confiscation that went on during the war. Now, you also mentioned cultural Marxism. Now, yes, I mean, Marx would have rooted things in sort of economic explanations, but the Frankfurt School, with people like Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse, Marx predicted that during a great war, the working classes would work together against the capitalist elites that were fighting the war. And World War I came around, and that didn't happen. The working classes towed into line with the great nations of the day: Russia, England, France, Germany, Austria, and the United States. And then the Frankfurt School decided that, well, what kept them from realizing their true Marxist identity was, essentially bourgeois values, which they identified with Christianity. And they decided to deconstruct Christianity and Western philosophy in order to remove any of the impediments to the working class becoming Marxist. And, you look at Marcuse and Reich in the 50s and 60s. Clearly, they were Marxists, and they were the unique fusion of Freudian psychoanalysis and Marxism. But the modern-day left, based in gender identity and sexual identity, was the result of this Marxist-Freudian fusion we see with Marcuse and Reich.
Well, what's interesting about that is, as I said earlier, the cultural Marxists, like the Frankfurt School, did really stand Marx on his head. The theory behind that, of course, is that before the workers can be ready for a socialist revolution, they have to have the correct ideas, what these people thought were the correct ideas. And they looked at the fact that the working class actually tends to be somewhat socially and culturally conservative. And they said, well, that's because they're getting what they call false consciousness from the system. They're saying, well, the government, the educational system, religion, and other institutions, what media they had back then, they would argue that all of those institutions are essentially, indoctrinating the working class to believe in what they consider to be reactionary values, rather than values that reflected the true self-interest of the working class, which was, in their view, socialism. So they thought, well, first thing we have to do is we have to gain control over the culture, and we have to control the institutions that reflect the values of the wider society, and then we can start shaping the consciousness of the working class towards socialism. That's certainly the kind of idea that you find in that kind of mid-20th century Western Marxism. But it's problematic to label that as Marxism. It could certainly be a revisionist form of Marxism, I suppose. But the idea that ideas are what is shaping society rather than the material conditions of society, I think, is a fundamental denial of a core Marxist theory. The idea that, well, the workers have wrong ideas, and that's why they're not going out and staging a socialist revolution. That strikes me as essentially rejecting the Marxist idea that ideas are simply the product of material condition. I think when Marxists start adopting ideas like that, what they're actually doing is they're embracing the thought of someone like Weber, or someone who said that the ideas are the force that shape history, not material conditions. So I think that's the real fundamental contradiction that you see in cultural Marxism. Whatever the intention of the cultural Marxists, whatever the intention of the Frankfurt Schoolers and people like that, or Lukács, or Antonio Gramsci, or whomever, I think that once they started taking it in that direction, they're essentially retreating from Marxism and they're moving towards something else. One of the core insights that the Frankfurt School people had, for example, Horkheimer talked about the culture industry. And I think he actually was onto something in his critique of the culture industry, where he was talking about how in modern technological societies of the type that were developing during his time, with the mass media and mass advertising and all of these kinds of things, which of course is even much more pronounced and expansive now than it was back then. He argued that it's really the culture industry that has the impact of shaping the cultural and ideological values of the society. And I think there's actually something to be said for that. I think that, you could look at modern societies and say that institutions like the mass media, the entertainment industry, the publishing industry, the film industry, television, increasingly internet, and in past times radio, and all of those institutions really are the main ways in which information and ideas are disseminated in the wider society, alongside things like education. In fact, we could argue that the media and the educational system in modern societies play the same role as something like, say, the church in an older society, say in a medieval society. I think there's actually something to be said for the culture industry theory that the Frankfurt School came up with. But once you start embracing that, I think it's sort of a retreat from Marxism, because Marxism would say, no, ideas are just a product of material conditions. And to embrace that theory is to imply that no, ideas have power in their own right, that ideas exist autonomously of material conditions and can have a certain amount of influence aside from material conditions. But the idea, though, that the workers don't really know their true self-interest due to false consciousness that's been inculcated in them by culture and that kind of thing, that theory certainly survives today. There was a whole book written about it back in the early 2000s, I guess it was in the 90s or the early 2000s, by Thomas Frank, a modern leftist who wrote a book called What's Wrong with Kansas, or something like that, where he was trying to say that the reason you have working class people in the United States voting Republican against their supposed economic self-interest was because of their reactionary cultural values that they've been taught by whomever. They arguing, for example, that instead of voting for the Democratic Party that's going to give them socialized medicine, they're voting Republican out of their opposition to gay marriage or something like that. Now, I think the theory is bunk. In fact, I even wrote a paper once debunking the theory, arguing, first of all, that it's not true that huge numbers of working class people are voting Republican Party for the Republicans, in any kind of significant way. The majority of the working class vote still goes for the Democrats, and to the degree that the Republicans are able to get working class voting, it tends to be geographically contained, where there are other issues involved. But so I don't think that theory is true on any level. But you see how pervasive that kind of thinking still is. I mean, I've known plenty of liberals and leftists over the years who swear by it.
Oh yeah. Well, in fact, right-wing populist movements have always been more able to get the votes than Marxists, whether it be fascism in Italy or National Socialism in Germany. In fact, with the rise of the Shining Path, not the Shining Path, the Golden Dawn in Greece, the Marx. I mean, I literally heard Greek Marxists complaining that it's not fair. They're taking our working class votes. But the idea of false consciousness and the superiority of ideas over material conditions. I guess it really gets to the point is how far can you deviate from the original Marxist values? For instance, Franz Fanon, the black liberationist, interpreted the bourgeoisie in terms of race, which itself is completely anachronistic to classical Marxism. There's absolutely no way that Marx would have interpreted the bourgeoisie in terms of race. In fact, a lot of third world Marxists were fascist because, I mean, what did Mussolini do? He treated Italy as the proletariat nation. And a lot of these third world Marxists, like in Indochina and in Africa and South America, treated their people as a proletariat race.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at that because the revolutionary anti-colonial movements that existed all throughout the 20th century and adopted Marxism, Leninism as their ideological foundation are interesting because they really were forms of revolutionary nationalism. Every one of those groups called itself the National Liberation Front. You know, there was the NLF, the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, the Sandinista National Liberation Front in Nicaragua, every far left revolutionary group in the third world called itself the something National Liberation Front, and it was all about anti-colonial revolution, and they adopted Marxism-Leninism as their prevailing philosophy. And as far as why that was, I tend to think it was rooted in multiple things. First, it was the power and prestige of the Soviet Union, and to a lesser degree, Maoist China. I think a lot of those movements simply wanted Soviet support. They wanted Soviet weapons and money and international political support and things like that. It was just the power and prestige of the Soviet Union. The other thing was it was widely believed during the 20th century that the Soviet model of economy, the idea of a planned economy, was going to eventually overtake the Western model of the market economy. Now, it didn't turn out that way, obviously, but it was widely thought that because Russia industrialized so rapidly from what was essentially a third world agrarian society in 1917, when the Bolshevik Revolution happened, to being an industrial power within a few decades. Because of that, it was thought that communism was able to achieve this kind of rapid industrialization, and that all of these revolutionary leaders in the third world wanted to industrialize their own nations as well, and some of them came up with some really wild and crazy ways of trying to do that. But that was, I think, one reason for the appeal of Marxism-Leninism. And another thing, too, is that if you're somebody that's personally seeking power, well, Marxism-Leninism is a great way to do it. I mean, the idea of having a revolutionary party with democratic centralism that acts in the name of an entire class, or in their case, an entire society, and then ostensibly rules in the name of the people and things like that. I mean, that's a great tool for power seekers to try to use. So I think that explains to a large degree why third world revolutionary movements tended to adopt this kind of outlook in the 20th century. But it is true that they in many ways more closely resembled fascism than actual Marxism, because they weren't really oriented towards the idea of an industrial proletariat that's overthrowing the bourgeois class. In fact, a lot of those societies, you barely even had an industrial proletariat, or a bourgeois class. Many of these societies were feudal, rural, agrarian, monarchical societies where whatever industry they had was actually very limited. So they did portray themselves as nationalist or as oppressed nations, as oppressed nations that were being oppressed by the international capitalist powers, which were either their current or former colonial overlords. Which in turn is very similar to Mussolini's idea about the idea of a proletarian nation that's involved again. The poor. His theory was that the poor nations, the proletarian nations of Southern Europe, were in class antagonism with the wealthy nations of the Atlantic. And the third world model of revolution really extends that into the third world. It's the third world versus the capitalist West. In fact, there was collaboration between fascist movements and Marxist movements around that kind of issue at various times. In Italy in the 70s, for example, there was a movement called Nazi Maoism, and these were neo-Nazi and neo-fascist groups in Italy, in the tradition of Mussolini and Hitler, who actually embraced third world Marxist revolutionary movements, in particular Maoist China. They saw Chairman Mao as a great nationalist revolutionary. They saw him as the Chinese Hitler, the Chinese Mussolini, and they would praise him for standing up to the Western capitalist powers. Some of these groups said they were for the fascist dictatorship of the proletariat. So there is some overlap there. And they do blend into each other fairly well. Another movement like that is the Ba'athist movement in the Arab countries. The Saddam Hussein, for example, was an admirer of Joseph Stalin, but the Ba'athist movement is was a kind of revolutionary national socialism as well. So you do see Marxism sort of evolving into this over time to something that looks a lot more like fascism in many ways. Marx himself, as far as his own ideas on things like race and nationality, Marx and Engels were very much Nordicist. Now, racial determinism was not a part of their theory. I mean, they were economic determinists, but in terms of their actual beliefs about race, they certainly were believers in the superiority of the Nordic, Northern European, Anglo-Saxon, and Germanic and Scandinavian peoples. And if you read their private correspondence and all of that, it's full of gutter racist language. Shockingly and politically incorrect. Certainly by
I think he called LaSalle a Jewish nigger.
Yeah, well, he went even further than that. Paul Lafarge. Paul Lafarge was Marx's son-in-law. He married Marx's daughter. I don't remember if it was Jenny or Eleanor. It was one of them. But he was, if you see pictures of him, he looks to be a mixed race person. He looks like he was probably part black, maybe a quarter black or something like that. He looks like a very light-skinned black person, or maybe a white person with the woolly hair texture that black people have. But in their private correspondence, Marx and Engels were talking about how Paul Lafarge was actually running for office in France, in Paris, for a district that included the Paris Zoo as a socialist candidate, and they were saying, well, Paul will be right at home representing the zoo or something like that, implying that blacks are just entitled or something like that. I mean, there was actually a book that came out back in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, by a black writer. I can't remember his name, but he was a former Marxist who became very critical of Marxism. And he actually published a book called Karl Marx Racist that actually delves into this quite a bit about what the views of Marx and Engels and people like that were on racial issues. I mean, they had the same kind of Nordicist, Anglo-Saxon supremacist or whatever views that were common among educated European elites at the time. Marx once referred to the Native American people and the Australian Aboriginal peoples as the indigenous people as non-historical peoples. Not very politically correct.
Yeah, definitely not. One of, I think, the most interesting criticisms of Marxism came from Lothrop Stoddard in his work, The Revolt Against Civilization, published in 1922. He's of course a racialist, though not quite a Nazi. I think during the 1930s he even criticized Nazi race theory by saying that many of the Nazis in the Nazi Party were not even Nordic, but from the middle European strata, the Alpines, rather than the Nordics. But he viewed the anarchists, the Marxists, these other revolutionary movements of his day as an expression of a kind of atavistic savagery. So, for instance, in ancient and medieval times, you had the nomads from the steppe that would ride in, burn everything to the ground, and then go back to their tents in the steppe. With the progress of civilization, those people were conquered. But what they didn't go away. What happened is those people that were formerly manifested as the nomads, the barbarians, the raiders, are transformed into these working class agitators. Since there was no more area that was free of state control, since the state had conquered the world, they then became subsumed in the state but didn't go away. And he views Marxists as an expression of this kind of atavistic need to destroy. He quotes a Russian police officer in his book who says that we thought Russia was a civilized society, but it's actually just a tent. And he made an analogy of the Scythian that sees a black speck on the horizon, realizing somebody's erected some structure. He swoops in and burns it to the ground, and then moves back to feeding his horses on the grassland. And in many ways, the Marxists are the 20th and the 19th and 20th century version of the Scythians and the Mongols, who just come in, flatten a place, and then move on to another place to destroy.
Well, there are a lot of critics of Marxism from a lot of different perspectives that offered some insights as to what was wrong with, or at least problematic with, some of the theories that he advanced. On the left, you had people like Bakunin, for example, who argued that the Marxist concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat would simply be a new kind of oppressive ruling class, and certainly every state anywhere in the world where Marxism became powerful or influential, that's more or less what happened. Another critic of Marxism was Pareto, Vilfredo Pareto, who argued something fairly similar, although Pareto was I guess a conservative, or he was sort of a neo-Machiavellian type, but he argued that there's no such thing as a society that does not have a ruling class. The idea that Marx had was he wanted to to abolish social classes and have a classless society. And Pareto argued that, well, the historical norm has been that you have elites and then you have counter elites, but there's no such thing as a society without elites. There's never been one. He also argued for what he called the 80-20 principle, and that is the idea that in any given society, about 20% of the society end up pulling the weight of the 80% of the society, that society tends to naturally stratify into social hierarchies. That was one of the criticisms that Pareto advanced of Marxism. And then there's others like Robert Michaels himself was a former Marxist who actually became a fascist eventually, but he argued, based on his studies of Marxist political parties in Europe, is that they were just as inegalitarian in terms of their internal structure as their counterparts were. He was saying, here we have these political parties that are committed to this idea of social and political and economic equality, and yet internally they're organized as pyramidical hierarchies, just like the right-wing parties are, the capitalist parties are, the aristocratic parties are. And because of that, he sort of came to the idea that there was this iron law of oligarchy, and that any kind of society, or at least any organization of any size, would have this natural elite at the top. The few are always going to lead the many. Those are some of the criticisms that were advanced of Marxism. One thing, though, in looking at Marxism and considering what Marxism may have gotten right, is that one thing that Marx did predict is that capitalism, as he understood it, which was the 19th century model of capitalism, the classical bourgeois capitalism with the big top-hatted capitalism, the John D. Rockefellers and all that, he predicted that would create a class conflict that would continue to widen, and that it would eventually be unable to sustain itself, that it would fall apart, and that it would be replaced, in his view, by socialism, which was a more collective society. And I think he was at least partially right about that. I think we could argue that the polarization of the classes, the social classes, did become very intense by the early 20th century. And that when the Great Depression came, it really was the worldwide collapse of Marxism, or of capitalism, that Marx had predicted. Now, of course, there are libertarians and others who say, well, that wasn't real capitalism, or the Great Depression was caused by the government. Well, the thing is that the government and capitalism are aligned with each other and working together. You can try to explain anything away if you or
try hard enough.
Yeah, if you use enough semantic tricks, But I mean, the capitalism collapsed. International capitalism collapsed during the Great Depression, and it was subsequently replaced by more collective societies. There was a really interesting book that was published in the 1930s. It was written by James Burnham. He was a former communist, and he had eventually become sort of, again, kind of a Machiavellian type of right-winger. He eventually went on to become a writer for William F. Buckley's National Review. But Burnham published a book called The Managerial Revolution in the 1930s, and he was examining the changes that were going on in different societies around the world, different industrial societies, meaning the United States, Western Europe, and fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, which were in power at the time, and Soviet Russia. And he argued that one thing that all of these industrial societies of the period had in common was that they were developing a new model of social organization. Even though their cultures, languages, forms of government, specific political institutions, even though all of those things were often much different from one another, they were all being remade into a type of mass society with large mass institutions that were organized as managerial bureaucracies. You had the growth of these massive bureaucracies with these layers of managerial classes in a way that was somewhat unprecedented historically, and that was tending to take the place of either the older aristocratic models of society like you had in Eastern Europe and Russia and places like that, or the bourgeois model of capitalism like you had in Western societies in the 19th century. And I think there was a lot of truth to that, in the sense that, in America, you had the New Deal and all of that. You had in England the growth of the Fabian movement and social democracy and all that. And the same in Western European countries. And then in Germany, you had Nazism. And even after the war, they replaced that with the social market economy. And then fascist Italy, a revolutionary anti-capitalism, and then, of course, Soviet communism. All of these systems did have the effect of replacing the older bourgeois capitalist model of economic organization, and the cultural differences and political differences are vast, but you do see the commonality being the growth of this kind of massive managerial society, which continues to exist. I mean, most all societies around the world today that are industrial, technological, capitalist societies are really sort of a hybrid capitalism and socialism. Like, for example, one thing I think is interesting is a lot of the free market type economists, like libertarian types and some others, frequently praise places like Singapore and Hong Kong as some sort of free market model, which I just don't get, because those countries are, well, I know Singapore in particular uses a lot of mercantilist, protectionist policies as a means of maintaining its international competitiveness in an industrial sense. That's how they built up their domestic economy there. 20% of their industries are state-owned. 80% of their housing market is state-owned. They have nationalized healthcare, and Hong Kong is similar. It's just an administrative district that's de facto appendage to the Chinese state. So I don't really get where these people claim that these are free market models. Maybe just because they're open to foreign trade or an investment or something. They're good for investor interest or something. But every modern industrial society has this kind of managerial system. Russia today, is no longer communist. They've done away with that, but they still have the system that came out of the managerial revolution. The managerial state and the bureaucracy and the corporate infrastructure and all of that. So that does seem to be something that's nearly universal in modern industrial societies.
Mm-hmm. One of the great critics of bureaucratization was the novelist Franz Kafka. He, Kafkaesque is synonymous with this bizarre, contradictory, labyrinthine system, which I think probably all too familiar with in our dealings with the U.S. government. But I think one of the most effective critics of Marx, especially defeating Marx on his own economic terms, was Ludwig von Mises. His discussion of the problem of economic calculation was pretty much insoluble from the perspective of the Marxists. And one could argue that the collapse of Marxism in the Soviet Union was a result of economic calculation, because all the shortages, they didn't know how much food to produce, they didn't know when to produce it, and so people would wait in long bread lines. There's a famous joke about the bread lines where a guy's in line with his wife and he says, this line's taking forever. And then he says, I'm going to join the line to shoot Gorbachev. And then he comes back about an hour later and she says, did you shoot Gorbachev? He's like, no, the line to shoot Gorbachev was too long.
Yeah, well, the kind of economic system that was established in the Soviet Union and that other Marxist-Leninist regimes tried to emulate was really an effort to take what amounted to a feudal model of production and apply it to an industrial society. And what I mean by that is, in a feudal system, when you engage in production, you're producing for subsistence. You're not producing things necessarily to buy and sell and generate profit. You're looking at it like, okay, we've got X amount of people living in the village. We've got to raise X amount of crops in order to have provisions for the winter. And we've got to have X amount of livestock, and we've got X amount of babies on the way or whatever. So production for subsistence based on consumption, that's what a feudal model of production is. And that's essentially what Marxism-Leninism was trying to do in an industrial context. They're trying to say, okay, we've got a nation of however many millions of people, and we need, X amount of pairs of shoes, and we need to produce X amounts of, quarts of milk or whatever. The problems with that are the ones you were describing, and others as well. First, there's the incentives problem. There's the issue of, well, if people are rewarded according to need rather than merit or labor, then what is the incentive for anyone to actually produce anything? And the way that they tried to get around that was with quotas. Factories and all of that would be given production quotas, which in turn meant that factory owners and workers would cheat. They would say, yeah, we filled their quota, and they've cooked the books. They've claimed they produced 5,000 pairs of shoes when they only produced 2,500 or something like that. That was one problem. Another issue was the knowledge problem. Which Hayek was the one that really Friedrich von Hayek was the one that really explored this a bit. But he argued that the problem with centrally planned economies is that you can't be everywhere at once. So you're always going to have a problem where your plans are way off the mark because there's always going to be variables you didn't consider. And then a related problem is the calculation problem. If you don't have the pricing system of the market, supply and demand, then you're really not going to know what you need to produce in order to meet the needs of consumption. And that's really one of the fundamental elements of Marxist-Leninist types of states, where what they're trying to do is abolish the law of value. They're trying to say, well, the things are not going to be sold, commodities are not going to be sold according to the principle of supply and demand. Instead, it's just things are going to be produced and distributed on the basis of need. So if we have, X amount of people, we've got to have X amount of houses and X amount of pairs of shoes and X amount of automobiles or whatever. And the problem with that is that it leads to tremendous inefficiency for all of these kinds of reasons. So what they would have in that system is, like you were saying, they would overproduce certain things. They would overproduce, say, cartons of milk. So you'd have cartons of milk going bad, spoiling, sitting on the shelf because nobody needs them. On the other hand, they would underproduce other stuff. So they'd underproduce, say, bread. So you stand in line for 2 days to get a loaf of bread or something like that. I heard some radio talk show host once talking about how it was a female. I don't remember who it was. I'm inclined to think Laura Ingraham, but she was saying that she went to the Soviet Union once to say as a student tourist or something, when that was still when that system was still together, and she had to stand in line half a day to get a piece of fruit, an apple or something like that. So that's the kind of problem they ended up having. Now, Mises' insight was that this system was not going to be sustainable over time, that it had no way of continuing to replicate itself, and eventually it would fall apart and it would fall behind the Western countries. What was interesting about it is that the process of industrialization that took place in Russia during the Lenin and then Stalin and then Khrushchev years actually occurred very rapidly. And that's where a lot of people started getting the idea that this was the wave of the future. But what happened was it wasn't sustainable over time. As time went on, the cracks in this kind of system started to show a bit, and eventually they started to fall further and further behind the Western market economies, which proved to be more resilient over time and more efficient and more productive. Eventually, to the point where they just the whole thing collapsed, and that's really the core economic criticism of Marxist economics. Marxist economics, one of its core ideas, theory aside, in terms of its application, what they want to do is have production for subsistence in a modern industrial society. The insight of Mises and some of these others was that that's extraordinarily difficult to do with any kind of efficiency or sustainability at all. And that's why in systems that have been organized like that, you see so much economic inefficiency. I mean, even in Venezuela now, which is fairly moderate compared to something like the Soviet Union. I wouldn't say that their model of socialism is nearly as extreme, but even there, they try to nationalize a whole lot of industries and engage in a lot of price fixing and things like that, and pursue this kind of model of production, and in perhaps a milder form. And even there now, it's created a lot of shortages and a lot of economic chaos. So it's true that once you remove the market as a mechanism for determining the cost of consumption, then you start running into problems.
Yeah, I mean, even England after World War II, beginning with Clement Attlee, tried to nationalize industry. That didn't work either. But a very interesting critic of Marx was the former Marxist Karl Wittevogel. And Karl Wittevogel used the concept of the Oriental mode of production from Karl Marx and the hydraulic empire from Max Weber to create a kind of analytical system. And he argued that the communist states of Russia and China never really got beyond the Asiatic mode of production, which is actually, I think, pre-feudal. And the other thing is that needs to be mentioned, you mentioned twice already, how people believe that communism was the economic future because of its rapid industrialization. The industrialization of the Soviet Union, it had nothing to do with communism. As Anthony Sutton pointed out, it was all entirely built by Western firms that were giving concessions by Lenin and Stalin. Yeah. And then Stalin nationalized them in the 30s. So it's really kind of a farce.
Well, yeah, that's something else that's often ignored. A lot of Russian industry was actually imported from the West during World War II. Keep in mind that the Western countries well, obviously not Germany, but the Western European countries in the United States were allies with the Soviet Union during World War II and provided the Soviet Union with a lot of assistance, financial and industrial and otherwise. Prior to that, though, it's interesting that Lenin, when he was only in power for 7 years himself, but towards the end of his reign, he actually tried to reintroduce capitalism. He actually called it the new economic policy. And as I understand it, the idea behind that was Lenin believed, as an orthodox Marxist, that Russia was really not appropriate for communism because it lacked the level of economic development it needed for communism. So he thought, well, first we've got to go through a capitalist stage where we actually use capitalism as a means to economic development, and that in turn will create the material conditions that will make communism possible. And he actually started to introduce policies like this, and they were reversed when Stalin came to power. Stalin always claimed that, well, when Lenin came up with this idea, he had a diseased mind due to failing health and things like that. But it's ironically, though, the policies that Lenin was trying to pursue at the time were not unlike what other communist nations have subsequently done, like China, for example. China has, since 1979, largely introduced capitalism as a means of generating economic development and growth. And Vietnam, starting in the early 80s, did the same thing. And now there's some talk of Cuba moving in that direction. Now that Fidel Castro is on his way out, his brother is scheduled to take over, and apparently he's in favor of the Chinese model. He wants to introduce that in Cuba as well. And of course, the way they rationalize this in Marxist states is they say, well, of course, Marx said you had to have capitalism first, right, to achieve the material conditions that made communism possible. But they have, some of those countries have experienced, economic growth and improvement in economic conditions since then. Another thing too is that if we look at the Western nations, there is some partial truth there to what Marx was saying as well, because it really was after the level of capitalist development and industrial development and technological development got to be at a certain point in the West that the modern Western welfare states really became possible. I mean, you had to have a certain amount of economic wealth in the society to create the kinds of elaborate welfare systems that you see in some Western countries today. In fact, the model that the left always cites for what their ideal socialist society would be is not the Soviet Union or any of those systems. They usually cite Sweden and maybe Norway and Denmark, some of those countries as their model societies. But what they've actually done in those Scandinavian countries is that first they had wealthy societies to begin with before all of the social democratic systems they have today were put into place. And once they did that, they at times found, well, perhaps we've been taking this a little bit too far. So they would actually liberalize a lot of their economic policies in order to continue to experience economic growth that in turn could, again, create the economic foundation for this kind of system that they have in some of the places. For example, in Finland and Norway, they've got this massive oil industry, oil wealth that subsidizes, their welfare state. In Sweden, it was already a wealthy nation before the socialists took over, and in recent years, they've actually liberalized their economic policies a bit, in part because they can no longer afford their welfare state, so they think, well, we've got to have wealth before we can redistribute it. And Denmark has pursued a similar path as well. So, there seems to be some truth in that. In every country that has tried to practice some kind of socialism, they have to have some kind of capitalist development first that actually produces the wealth that makes, social democracy or democratic socialism or whatever they want to call it, workable.
Well, it's like what Margaret Thatcher said, sooner or later you run out of other people's money. But Murray Rothbard, in his critique of anarcho-communism, I think he was onto something with the entire socialist mentality, that if it's left unchecked, it will consume all of the usable capital and reduce us to a primitivist level of existence.
Well, a lot of anarcho-communists are anarcho-primitivists as well, so maybe that's the goal.
Well, I think that's whether all socialists want to go there or just the primitivists. I think that's the logical end state, because once you've consumed up all the capital and you're not adding to the capital, if you consume from the chain of production and you're not adding to the chain of production, which socialism doesn't do, then eventually the chain of production will be destroyed and will revert back to a pre-capitalist, feudal, or even less developed economy.
Yeah, and that's why in hardline socialist societies, they actually have a very intolerant view of slackers. In the Soviet Union, for example, being unemployed was against the law. They considered being unemployed to be criminal parasitism, and there was no such thing as hanging out on a street corner panhandling in the Soviet Union. In a system like that really takes the socialist or communist ethos seriously, they have a very low level of sympathy for people they consider to have no work ethic. And that's which is interesting, because the Western idea of socialism is, well, everybody just kind of lounges around and lives off the state or whatever, but that's not how they actually did it in those kinds of systems. As far as examples of anarcho-communism or something similar to anarcho-communism actually working, the examples that I see that people cite that have some credibility are things like actual communes. There's one here that's well known that's not far from where I live. It's called Twin Oaks, which has been in existence for decades. But that's sort of like a commune that's run as a capitalist business. I mean, it's a commune in terms of its internal structures, but its relationship to the wider society is essentially that of a business. They have products they sell and that kind of stuff. Another is the Israeli kibbutzim, and that system. It's hard to gauge the economic success of those in their own right because they're still submerged in the wider capitalist, Israeli society. It's also true that the most successful kibbutzim have a strong religious and ethnic ethos to them. Like the high ranks of the IDF, for example, tend to be people that originate from those. So maybe there's something to that. You have to have a really strong sense of social and collective solidarity to make that kind of system work. But the main problem that anarcho-communists run into is, again, the calculation problem. And given that they don't believe in markets or in central planning, either one, they come up with a lot of creative ways to try to get around that. The big thing they seem to be on to nowadays is planning by means of decentralized computer networks, which, it's kind of like the Zeitgeist people or Venus Project or whatever, into which, that strikes me as more like science fiction. It's more like some transhumanism or something. I think to really advocate seriously for a social system, you have to have some kind of working model that can justify and legitimize it. Some kind of test market, if you will, or a laboratory example. And I don't know that they've proven their case. But it is interesting that virtually all modern industrial societies have basically the same system, this kind of managerial state capitalist, hybrid socialist capitalist system.
Yeah. Well, we're almost out of time, so if you have any last words.
One thing I do think is interesting, though, about Marxism is just the distorted view that people have of what it is, particularly in the United States. You have people, for example, that think that Obama is a Marxist revolutionary, which strikes me as just way beyond the pale of rational thinking. I mean, the Marxists are not subsidized by Goldman Sachs. I mean, they're not going to have a revolutionary Marxist candidate as their front man.
Well, they would in foreign countries. I mean, the Rockefellers funded Lenin.
Yeah, well, it's there's always these alliances of conveniences that happen from time to time. But someone like Obama, he doesn't strike me as a Marxist revolutionary. He strikes me as a careerist. He's the kind of guy if he were in the private sector, his whole life would just be about becoming CEO eventually. And Tim Kaine, for example, I think he's a lot like that guy. Tim Kaine, who's the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats, actually used to be my city councilman for like 7 years. And that's what he is. He's just a careerist. But Marxism, a lot of things get labeled socialism or Marxism that I don't think are appropriate. So it is helpful to have some kind of understanding of what it actually is.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for coming on, Keith. This is Todd Lewis from the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.